And welcome to Let 'em Talk. I'm Paul Durienzo with my funny sweater. It's cold out. I need a warm sweater. All right, welcome to Let 'em Talk. And we have a great show for you today. My guest, Leona Morgan, is joining us again. And by serendipity, we met today and was able to organize this program. And it's a very important issue, especially since we were just talking about Indian Point and the tritium leak that happened here. Leona Morgan is an expert on nuclear matters concerning particularly the mining for uranium that went on in the southwestern United States, in which native miners were used to dig up the uranium that was used mostly in the Cold War to build all those atom bombs they built. I mean, who did the work? I mean, atom bombs are a big industrial enterprise that begins with digging the uranium fuel for the bombs out of the ground. Whatever happened to those mines? Whatever happened to the people who were involved in that? Leona is going to tell us a lot about that. So welcome, Leona Morgan, to Let Them Talk.
Hi, thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me today.
Oh, it's great to have you here. And so let's begin by explaining to people something about yourself. Tell us about yourself and your organizational interest in all of this.
Okay.
And your personal interest in it as well.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm a co-founder of an organization called Diné, No Nukes, and that is an organization focused mostly on education. And so I did a lot of work in preventing an in situ leach uranium mine. We call it an ISL mine, which is basically uranium mining using water. And we're in the desert, so there's not a lot of water. We successfully stopped that project in 2014, which I'm really happy about. And the thing I learned in that process was that it's really hard to fight something if people do not know what you're talking about. So uranium, radiation, these things are kind of hard concepts to grasp if you don't have a working knowledge of them. So our organization is focused mostly on education and for the sole protection of water, our land, sacred areas, and life. I'm also part of a collective. We call ourselves, in our language, water is our power, water is our strength.
And what is that in Diné?
In Diné, it's a to be nihidil, to be nihidil. So that's, you can search us on Facebook.
I had Lenny Foster here one time, and he spoke for 10 minutes straight in your language, and that was great. I thought it was the most wonderful show we ever did. So feel free to speak. Americans might, the people who listen who don't know, might know Diné as the Navajo people, which is the incorrect name that was sort of slapped on. Like many, like the Sioux, there's nobody who calls themselves Sioux in the world, right? But, these are language names that were slapped on Native people over the generations that necessarily were not what the people themselves call themselves.
Oh, absolutely. Our people, actually, Diné is like a group of many different peoples. We had a lot of different, today we use our clans to identify ourselves. So I'll just back up a little bit and introduce myself with my clans. So normally we would start, and I would start like a presentation or at meetings, we identify ourselves this way. And so, Yate, hello, She'e Leona Morgan Yinshia, Torij Eatni Nishle, Tinal Bitli Bashishchi, Kia Ani Dashiche, Tohaglini Dashanella. Beldil da sinelde shagan teho toidan nasha ado uranium issues ba nashnish. Yeah, and then I forgot, usually because we're a matrilineal society, we always identify our parents, and so I'll just do that real quickly. Shema a Lena Jean Morgan will yeah. Na dishkij dan ado shije a James Morgan will yeah. Oditsin dan.
So you're known as Leona, the son and the daughter of your father and daughter of your mother.
Daughter of my mother and then my father.
Mother first, and matrilineal, which means on the mother's side, right?
Yeah.
Oh wow, interesting. And so you have the Diné people have the they were sitting on uranium mines. I mean, sitting on the element uranium in their soil, in their rock, in their stone for a time immemorial. And then one day in the 1940s, a man named Oppenheimer and a general named Groves came down near side and started paying people to start digging.
Yeah, I don't know if Oppenheimer ever came to our area, but I mean, essentially the Manhattan Project was, the beginning of the end for a lot of us when it comes to, protection from cancer and different things that are resulting today. So we are really, really uranium's all over the world. But we just happen to live in a place where there's, some that people like Oppenheimer and, of course, the U.S. government decided to dig. And so all over the world there is uranium, but I think it's mostly accessed over the lands that, are occupied by various indigenous people, basically brown people. And so there's a definite form of environmental racism.
Right, that's interesting because it turns out that at one time uranium was considered a rare element that was hard to find and had to be husbanded and saved and protected, and the areas that where it was found were considered places where rare spots on the earth where you could find it. And then la-di-da, it turns out it's a way more common element than people realize, and it's everywhere and can be taken out of seawater and the Arctic and all different parts of the world. However, what you're saying is they took it out of indigenous people's land.
Right. All over the world, they estimate 70 to 75% of the uranium is mined on indigenous people's lands. I mean, really, when you think about the United States and North America and South America, it's all indigenous people's lands. It's just, then the United States happened. But there's indigenous people who are still culturally traditional, living in places like Mongolia, Australia, Saskatchewan. Canada is pretty inundated by uranium mining, and then of course us in North America.
What do they do with all this uranium now? They're still mining it?
Yeah, there's mining going on today, despite all of the, horrible things it does to the environment, the animals, the plants, and of course us as human beings.
What do they use it for? I mean, bomb production, I think, is down. It's supposed to be anyway, as far as I know. They're using it for fuel for nuclear power plants.
Well, fuel for nuclear power plants, and of course there's always going to be bombs if the United States continues, its imperialistic ways. I think I was reading there was, there were celebrations about, the new smaller bombs that are being made, just like nuclear reactors. There's new smaller modular reactors. So right now, it's still being used for both.
So that's interesting because it's nuclear power, and the whole nuclear world is often touted as as something that's an alternative, a clean energy alternative. That 1 gram of 1 ounce of uranium is equal to a ton of coal, and that it doesn't produce greenhouse gases. It's often described in the same breath as wind and solar and other alternative forms of energy.
Right.
What do you think of that?
Well, the United States EPA actually created incentives for nuclear power in its Clean Power Plan, and so that's as one of my friends says, he's a coordinator for Clean Up the Mines. One of the quotes that he has on a huge banner is, "Clean nuclear is a dirty lie." And because when they calculate the emissions from the steam towers, basically the cooling towers, basically they're calculating only a tiny percentage of what's coming out of the nuclear power fuel chain. So we, always have to remind everyone, it starts with uranium mining, and then there's the processing, the enrichment, the fuel fabrication, several steps before you reach a nuclear power reactor. And of course the transport. So all of those mechanisms are fueled by coal-fired power plants, oil and gas. And so when you add everything up, I don't know if anyone's done that actually for any power plant to add up the entire cost, because if you're taking uranium out of the ground, somewhere else, it's going to take a lot of energy to move it to whatever reactor you're using. And oftentimes the United States imports uranium. So, there's a lot of transport in place, especially
in ships and planes, or whatever, however they get it from other countries, other parts of the world. Very interesting. Now, what is the environmental impact for the Diné people in what is today New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado? What has been the effect on the people who lived amongst these mines, which were, now it's my understanding that they pretty much, the government was paying top dollar to folks and encouraging them to start mining wherever they could find it and then delivering the uranium to the United States government, and that this caused sort of a gold rush, sort of land rush on uranium mining, and led to many, I think we discussed this last time we were here, the uranium mines started to pop up everywhere. Right, and now you're stuck with the tailings and all. Tell us a little bit about that. What's the effect? What's the impact?
Well, the boom was, predominantly before the NEPA Act was passed, the National Environmental Policy Act. And so because the boom was mostly between the 50s and 70s, all of that mining, predates the public comment process. So most of the time, and of course the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples wasn't created until 2007, and all of that mining basically was done without public consent, without free and informed or prior consent, and also without laws in place that said that the companies have to clean up. So essentially what happened was we are left with over 15,000 abandoned uranium mines all across the United States. Most are west of the Mississippi. There's a couple in this area up in this region of the country, but Colorado has the most. For us as indigenous people within the Four Sacred Mountains, the Diné, we had a huge area that we consider our homelands, which was in the states you mentioned, the Four Corner states, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. Today, our nation, the Navajo Nation, does not include any land within the state of Colorado. However, the state of Colorado has the most abandoned uranium mines. And there's quite a few in the area where the Gold King mine spill occurred. So I'm curious, what was picked up when that spill happened in August. However, we have 523 distinct sites.
That was the river that turned orange that we saw in the summertime in the news, right? And that was a huge dam broke, and the stuff that was inside the mine just flooded out into the environment.
Yeah, that occurred on August 5th. And something that I'd like to highlight was that there is a community. So you're asking what happened today. There's a lot of contamination still left. The United States has this 5-year plan, which is supposed to be a process to clean up all the abandoned uranium mines on Navajo Nation. We don't have a process for the entire country. So on Navajo Nation, this 5-year plan is attacking some of these mines. So they might claim that 2 have been cleaned up or are in the process of being cleaned up. However, they essentially just mitigate the problem and contain it. There's actually no real cleanup, like cleaning up the groundwater or the surface. What they've done is try to characterize the area and then monitor it. So in many places, depending if it's a mill site, they will do very minimal. And then if it's the EPA cleaning it up under this 5-year plan, they'll do a better job. But essentially what they're doing is creating 525 permanent waste sites on Navajo. So, what are they going to do with the other 15,000 in the entire country?
I've heard this in Hanford and in St. Louis, where they have a dump there. In western New York State, basically, they're turning these old Cold War and World War II era nuclear waste sites. They come and say they're going to clean them up, but they really turn them into a dump and then start importing stuff from other places to concentrate it in that place.
Well, it's really interesting because in Church Rock, I think we talked about that last time, there's a community that lives within the area. There's within a quarter-mile area, there's 2 old conventional mines, and then the mill that was that they were using.
What does a mill do?
The mill is where you process the ore. So conventional mining's when you get the rock out of the ground, or you could do go into a mountain, horizontally, and then also what I'm talking about is a conventional mine through a shaft. But they also had open pit mining and different forms of this conventional method. Earlier I mentioned ISL, which was basically injecting a solution in the aquifer to pull up uranium. But the mill is where they get the ore, they get the rock, and then they crush it and grind it, and then they process it with water to get yellow cake.
And what are tailings?
Tailings are the mill waste. So you have mine waste that is from the mine when they bring up, when they're digging the shaft, they have these huge piles that they end up with, and then there's also a lot of dewatering. Well, yeah, they basically, if they do some remediation, oftentimes they fill in the shaft with the mine waste. But tailings, like for instance from the UNC mill that was in north of
United Nuclear Corporation.
Yeah,
right?
United Nuclear. So we talked about this last time, was that huge spill in 1979. And that spill went into the Puerco River and flowed west into Arizona. So in July 2015, one of my colleagues, a member within Diné No Nukes, Mr. Tommy Rock, with help from Chris Shuey, they got an EPA grant. It's kind of ironic because EPA didn't do these studies. It took community people to make the effort. They discovered, they did testing along that river, they tested all over different wells, regulated and unregulated. Unregulated being like windmills and those kinds of things. But within this testing, they found that regulated wells that are even used for drinking water were highly contaminated with uranium. I mean, I'm not a scientist, so they also tested
for... Uranium is radioactive, and if you get radioactive elements inside of your body, you risk the possibility of getting cancer.
And kidney disease and some other problems. So they also tested for gross alpha and radium, 2 different types. What they found was that the concern really are for the 2 wells that are being used. I think there was 7 that tested high with uranium, and a couple of them are used for drinking water. So people in the community of Sanders, this is downstream from the Church Rock spill.
Not in Bernie Sanders.
No, this is in Arizona.
Right.
So I mean, if you think about the Navajo Nation being divided by states, it's also divided by EPA regions. So the spill occurred in EPA Region 6 on the New Mexico side and spilled into the Arizona side, which is EPA Region 9. And what happened was, I believe that the contamination in Sanders, which is on the Arizona side, was a result of the UNC 1979 tailings spill. However, the EPA Region 6, there's a woman there, I don't know if I should say her name, but she, got in our face and said, prove it. They're putting the burden of proof on us as a community. So what happened is Tommy Rock and Chris Shuey got this grant. They did a lot of sampling, and they found that in some wells they were receiving, the people in the community were getting out of their tap 59.5 parts per billion. The legal limit for uranium in drinking water is 30 parts per billion. So it's pretty much twice
Double.
the legal limit.
Sounds like Flint, Michigan.
So exactly. And what happened was...
So what's happening in Flint is nothing new.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of differences in the community,
Right.
government agencies. There's
but
huge
as far
differences.
as everybody turning their back and allowing people to drink
yeah.
contaminated water from their wells and not saying, and then telling people they were foolish and stupid and what are you telling me, prove it, and all these kind of things.
Well, on top of that, the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality sent the community a letter on August 4th saying, yes, your water is contaminated, but it does not pose an immediate risk to your health. And you do not have to find an alternate source of drinking water. Until we treat it, you'll be fine unless you're drinking, lots of water every day for 70 years.
Okay. So let's this is all fascinating. Now I think we got a basis because right now we have this thing in Indian Point, a nuclear plant about 40 miles from here, near the largest city in the country. It's 40 plus years old, and they're trying to get an extension on the 2 units on their license. And just recently we had a massive tritium leak, and there's been 7 malfunctions in just the last 6 months. And last May they even had a giant explosion of a transformer that scared the hell out of everybody in the community there when it went off. So we even here, this is the end use, right? Because it's to a place like Indian Point that some of that uranium comes as fuel for the nuclear reactor. So that's very interesting to make that connection. But I want to know exactly what's going on. You want to tell us some things that you're doing and your organization is doing that we might be able to help and learn something about. So why don't I give you that opportunity and how we can find more information and whatever.
Yeah, just to wrap up, that I was mentioning the letter to the community saying that contamination exists was on August 4th, and then on August 5th was the Gold King mine spill. So the community really didn't receive any attention from not just the U.S., but our own Navajo Nation government. So right now, what the community is doing is they're trying to gather resources, and there's a website that folks can go to, which is on a GoFundMe page. You can do GoFundMe/Water for Sanders. And so what they're doing is raising money for maybe legal help, and then also to get water.
So GoFundMe, Water for Sanders. So go to GoFundMe, and it's Water for Sanders. And there's a GoFundMe that's sending water to Flint.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah.
And what's next? Or is it send water to New York? I mean, I don't know. So this is all very interesting. GoFundMe, Water for Sanders, which is a town in Arizona whose water supply is contaminated by uranium mining, and where everybody told you that there was no problem. Then when they discovered there was a problem, they said it wasn't a serious problem. And then the next day there was a huge flood, and the local waters were totally inundated with poison from various mines. All very interesting. This is, to me, very, it's telling us a larger story about our position in society and exactly what's happening with indigenous people. So I find that very interesting. It could have been anything. It could be radiation one day. It could be cattle and wolves and things like that another day. Whatever it is. Right? Okay, very good. Our environment is at risk, ladies and gentlemen in the audience. Our environment is in direct risk, and our lives' existence and our future is at risk by these kind of events that are happening. So people can go to Sanders, and now we have a video, and we could play some of that video. You want to play the video?
Yeah, I can just explain what it's about.
Quickly.
Basically, the government is not monitoring, and they use a lot of the data from the companies that did mining. So when they're doing cleanup, they clean up to the company's data.
Right.
And so we started a project to do our own monitoring, and so that's what the video is about.
Right. Okay, let's watch the video now. And I have to say that similar things happened in Hanford, where the local community had to go out and do their own studies of the people who were the downwinders there, thousands of people who were had these things happen to them and were poisoned by these things. And here we go.
Hi, my name is Yuko. I am standing here on the Hudson River and also by the Indian Point nuclear power plant in Buchanan, New York. You can see the two aging reactors behind me. They have been operating since the mid-70s. They are located about 25 miles north of the Bronx, and about 17 million people live and work within the 50-mile radius.
My name is Leona Morgan, and I'm with Diné No Nukes. We are standing here today along New Mexico Highway 566 north of Church Rock, New Mexico, near the site of the 1979 UNC uranium tailings spill.
I'm Director of Nuclear Energy Information Service. This is Nuclear Illinois, the most nuclear reliant state in the country. If we were a nation, we'd be the 13th largest nuclear power because we have 14 nuclear reactors here. We have a high-level radioactive waste dump. We have several closed, low-level radioactive waste dumps, some of which are leaking.
This is the place where over 100 million gallons of liquid contaminated radioactive waste broke from an earthen dam that was being used by UNC. UNC had a mill site here, and they were storing their radioactive waste over there. That spill has never been fully cleaned up. This place all the way to Arizona. So it's impossible to know how much radiation is coming from this site today. We are standing along a public highway. There's a couple of little signs over there, but there are no monitoring equipment and there is no data on the actual levels of radiation in this community.
So are these reactors leaking any radiation today? Most likely yes. By federal regulation, all nuclear power plants are permitted to release some levels of radiation every day. My Geiger counter or radiation detector is not beeping right now, but depending on the wind direction and where I am standing, the numbers go up sometimes 3 times or 10 times higher than what is considered safe.
And in the first week of November at Metropolis, Illinois, at the southern end of the state, there was a release of hazardous uranium hexafluoride gas off-site.
So I don't really feel safe staying out here for a long time, and I wonder what it means to people who live in this area.
Radiation is invisible, odorless, and tasteless, but is toxic and can cause various illnesses even in low levels. The radioactive materials are emitted from nuclear reactors, weapons laboratories, uranium mining sites, and waste facilities. Following the recent nuclear events in Fukushima, we have learned from people in Japan the consequences of a possible nuclear crisis, and also how many people took the power of their own autonomy to protect themselves by monitoring radioactivity in their communities.
If I were to send people into these communities to monitor this, how would I know they're safe? How do the people in those communities know that they're safe when things like this happen? The answer is they don't. Our job is to try and provide that information, and the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we can raise the money to get radiation monitors and put them in the field.
And so in order for the communities to understand the radiation levels here, we need to start monitoring. Being in such a rural location, it's really hard to know when we're passing through a former mine site because there's a lack of signs, there's a lack of infrastructure. That is an old mine site. Today, they have not been removed or cleaned up. In some places, the buildings are gone and the dirt that remains is radioactive. But it's impossible for people to know without proper equipment.
With your help, we intend to raise $15,000 to buy 10 radiation detectors. Distribute them throughout the contaminated and frontline communities in the U.S., and secure the professional training needed to learn how to detect and interpret radiation.
We're hoping to get radiation detectors to help local residents to be aware of the radiation levels here, to keep their families and to keep the community safe. So if you want to learn more or to donate and contribute to the project, please visit www.dinenonukes.org. Thank you.
And great. That was very interesting. We don't have a lot of time, so I want to focus. Leona Morgan, that was you in the territory there. We saw you out there. And a connection to, of course, amazingly, to Indian Point, which is in the news today and which we were just talking about a minute ago. So it was apropos. And to think that we just talked maybe a couple hours ago and set the show up like 2 hours ago or something. So it was great. Thank you so much. So, Leona, what does this all mean? I mean, we only got a couple of minutes. How do you sum it up? What's going on here?
Well,
I know you're doing training and stuff.
The video you guys just saw is basically an educational project that we're doing to help folks to monitor so we can figure out our own background, so we can, stop new mining, or also to get records in the books that, show that these places are not contaminated. But for all the 15,000 abandoned uranium mines out there, there is a bill that we're trying to get passed in Congress. My friend who I mentioned is working on Clean Up the Mines, which is a bill that's being, we hope to have it sponsored by Grijalva, representative from Arizona. Right now, the bill has already been written, but we're still waiting for it to be introduced. What would that bill do? Basically inventory all of the 15,000 abandoned uranium mines, characterize them, and then figure out what is all the contamination, structures, land, water that might be in danger.
Are people opposing it? Are there forces opposed to this?
Right now, I haven't heard any opposition, except that there's only been, the excuse is that there's no money. But these were problems created by the United States government, so they should put the money up to clean up the 15,000 plus abandoned uranium mines across the country.
15,000 abandoned uranium mines across the United States. And we were just discussing this uranium right here in New York City and from the Manhattan Project as well. Very good. Thank you very much, Leona, for joining us, and we'll have you again next time.
Great. Thank you, Paul.
Great. We did it.
Okay, good deal.
Cool.
Managed to
be
get it.
careful.